Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be starting something that I'm going to call the map of the day. So typically when I make videos and showcase sample maps, it's usually emphasizing a specific aspect of that map, which is related to a particular topic. So today I'm going to switch gears slightly and talk about many aspects of one particular map. And I'll explain like the thought process behind it and as well as the minutia of the code. So the map in question is going to be this map, which is Rocky Pond. So this is pretty much a remake of an older map that I had made, which is Rocky Pond version 1. So in version 1, the map concept was relatively simple. It's just a map with very many cliffs on it and a big lake in the middle. And the reason I remade this was because the original version was lacking in some originality and some strategic depth. So basically, the only really viable strategy on this map was to wall your base and go for the water. And whoever ends up winning the water is probably going to win the game, since there's not really much opportunity for counter aggression on the land, since walling your base is so easy. So, um, so here we have Rocky Pond version 2, and I'll be recreating this step by step and kind of show the process behind it. So before we start constructing this, let's briefly go over what it's going to be about. So basically, the players are all in a circle here, and they have relatively standard resources, aside from the fact that they have no personal stone mines. All of these stone mines on the map are going to be on this elevated portion where this dirt is. And that's going to be very close to this central water area. So this central water area is not going to contain very many fish at all. But what it will contain is it contains relics on all these shallow portions. And yeah, and they also have a transport ship starting right in the middle here, so they can explore the water area from the start of the game. So we'll go into a blank test map here, and we'll start this right from a blank code. So let's just start out with the player setup. And for this is going to be random placement. And since all the players are going to be in a circle, we can use random placement. We don't need to use direct placement. And since the teammates aren't going to be very close together, we're not going to use the group by team. So the next section we'll take a look at is land generation. And the first thing we'll do here is specify the base terrain, which would be base terrain dirt 3. And if we look, we can see we specified dirt 3. And now what we'll do is we'll create the generic land in the middle of the map. So that's going to be terrain type DLC rock, which is going to be the elevated portion. And then after we've created the hill on this rock terrain, then we can create the water in the middle. So we'll specify the land percent, and then we'll specify some borders. So we'll call 22% borders on each side. So at the top, bottom, right, and left. And just for good measure, we'll specify the land position at 50-50 to make sure the origin of this land is in the middle. So if we look, we can see that we have successfully created that land at 22% of the borders. And then next we can create the player lands, which are going to be the same terrain type as the base terrain. So the terrain type is going to be dirt 3. Specify land percent at, say, 15. And what we're going to need here is a base size. We'll call that 9 for now. And then other zone avoidance distance is going to be 15. And we can see what effect that's going to have on our land. It'll actually be easier to see if I change the base terrain a little. So now if we take a look at this, we can see that now that the base terrain of the map has been changed to grass, it's much easier to see where the player lands are going to be respect to the rest of the map and this middle area. So this is what we're going to use for now. And of course we can change it later if we need to. So let's move on to the elevation section. So elevation generation, we'll create elevation 5. It's going to be on base terrain DLC rock, and then the number of tiles, since we want it to cover the entire area, we'll specify a large number, which will be 100,000. Number of clumps, 1,000. We can set, and we can see what this does. So now we can see that we're able to elevate this portion of land. And what I want to notice here is that the player that's going to be spawning here may not have enough space between the start of his base and the start of this unbuildable terrain. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to slightly modify the player lands a bit. So I'm going to increase the base size from 9 to 11, and I'm going to increase the overall volume of the player lands from 15 to 25%. So let's try and see what this does. So now we can see that, for example, here, since the player is going to be spawning here, now it's going to be carving into this middle section a bit more so than it was when the base size was lower and the overall land percent was lower. That's what we can do there. And then, in addition to this, I'll create another elevation statement that's going to be one elevation higher with the spacing attribute of 8. So we can see what this did is it just created like a little bump here. So the next step in constructing this map is that I want to make sure that the rock terrain is only going to appear on the elevated tiles of the hill rather than occupying the flat portion, because this is going to end up being dirt. So let's see how we do that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to then go into terrain generation, and we'll just use grass terrain as a placeholder for now. Grass. And when we're trying to place terrain on flat terrain, we will probably need the attribute set flat terrain only. And so if I specify flat terrain only and specify the base terrain to be DLC rock, land percent going to be 100. Number of clumps is going to be a big number because we want it to take up the entire area. And then of course set flat terrain only doesn't work on its own. It needs a spacing to terrain types attribute of at least 1. And so we can see that we're getting a bit closer to what we're trying to achieve, but again we have this issue where there's 3 tile width on this elevated portion as opposed to 1 tile. So what this means is that the terrain that we've created our central land on is going to have to be a bit different. So I changed the base terrain of the map to grass, but it's actually supposed to be dirt 3. So, and then instead of creating the central land as rock, I'll create that as grass. And then instead of elevating the rock, we'll elevate the grass. And then we'll put some temporary terrain on the grass instead of the rock terrain. So we can see that we're starting out from this position here, and now with this 3 tile width here, we can target the slopes of this land by having a similar statement, which is creating DLC rock on top of this grass. And we're not going to have flat terrain only because we want it to target those elevated portions. And so this is what we're achieving here. We're able to target specifically the slopes of the map using a method such as that. And now that we don't need that particular grass terrain anymore, we can cover that back up with dirt 3. And the only difference is we're not going to set flat terrain only, and we're not going to set a spacing to other terrain types. So that little portion got left out here, so we'll set scale by groups, and then we'll just copy and paste this statement again for good measure. Okay, so now we're in a position where all the slopes of this hill are going to be covered in rock terrain, and the flat portions are not. So on this top portion, we're going to have our water, and on this intermediate portion, we're going to have the dirt 2, which is where all the stone mines are going to get placed. So we'll create water on top of dirt 3, and then we'll specify height limits for this, which is going to be on elevation 6 and not elevation 5. So height limits are going to be 6, 6. And then the intermediate terrain is going to be dirt 2. And that's going to be at height limits 5, 5. And we can see that once this water is generated on top, since it has to create a beach border like this, it'll actually get rid of our rock terrain. So to compensate for that, we will add a spacing to other terrain types 1, and we can then preserve this one layer of rock terrain that's between the water and the intermediate land over here. So continuing on with terrain generation, we'll take a look at creating forest for players. So we'll create terrain, which is going to be pine forest. The base terrain is going to be dirt 3. The land percent is not going to be 100. It's going to be 10. We'll specify 12 clumps, set scale by groups, and we'll specify height limits 0, 0, so that we can make sure that we're here at the bottom. And if we generate that, we can see it created our forest, but we're not necessarily done yet. So we also need to make sure that the forest is avoiding the player's start areas. So set avoid player start areas, and then we're going to have a spacing to other terrain types attribute of 3 also, so that the player forest is going to stay a little bit away from the rock terrain, so it's not touching. And then we'll create some more forest, which is going to be on top of the rocks. So on top of DLC rock. that percentage is going to be fairly small. We can have very many clumps, and we're not going to specify height limits. We don't really care about avoiding player start areas. It's going to do that pretty much automatically since the rock terrain is not close to the player lands. And spacing to other terrain types is going to be 1. And we'll see what this did here is it created some forest on this terrain over here. And then we'll create one more forest terrain, which is going to be on top of this this dirt 2. So we'll have a very small area because we don't want to obstruct the placement of the stone. Tiles is going to be 25. And then we'll see what we'll place on dirt 2. And we'll lower the amount of clumps for a bit. We'll lower the clumps to 12. And we can see what that did here. So as far as the functional terrains go, there's only really one more thing left to do. And that is to create the patches of shallows, which the relics are going to be on. So we'll create shallow on top of water. The land percent can be 2. Number of clumps can still be 12. And we'll specify spacing to other terrain types of 3. And then we can see what this did here. We have little patches of shallows here where we can place relics later on. And lastly, we're going to add a few aesthetic things. So what will we do? We'll create some dirt snow on top of the dirt 3. We'll call it 10%, 24 clumps. Doesn't really matter. It's just for aesthetic purposes. And then we'll create some medium water on top of water with some spacing. So we can see the medium water created there and the patches of dirt snow created on top of that dirt 3. And that does it for the terrain generation section. And now if I compare the state of the map now to what it's supposed to look like in the end, well, where is that? Rocky Pond 2. There's one key difference that I want to point out, and that's the fact that we have a few cliffs here on the map. So if we go back to the test map here, we can see that there are no cliffs here. And let's see what happens if we try to put a cliff generation section in here. So we'll have a cliff generation section in here. And we can see that even though we have no parameters specified, it'll still create a few cliffs for us. And one thing to notice is that the cliffs are able to spawn right in the water here, which is something we would like to avoid. So in order to prevent this from happening, we need to understand something about cliffs. And that's the fact that cliffs occur before the terrain generation section of the map. So if we were to move this cliff generation section up here, and then comment out the terrain generation section, we can see that since the middle terrain was created as a terrain that a cliff can be placed on, there's nothing that's going to prevent cliffs from being placed here. So let's say, for example, that we change this land in the middle to something that a cliff cannot be placed on. So we'll place all the grass in here, with water. And we can see that when we are now generating the cliffs on the map, since this terrain cannot have cliffs on it, it's going to prevent the cliffs from being placed in the middle. And so we'll find the other places where we had grass. So we'll just replace all the grass with water. And now when we uncomment everything, we can see we have the exact same map, except the cliffs are no longer able to spawn in the middle here. You can keep generating and make sure that that's not the case. So we'll complete this cliff section here. There's no need to waste time going through all the details of this. So we have our cliffs section done, and then all that should be left to do then is objects generation. So we have our objects generation here. So the first thing we're going to do in order to keep the theme of the map, which is Rocky Pond, we're going to create an object, rock. And for the number of objects, we're going to start it out at 7, but we'll also add a group variance to this number of objects, 7, a group variance to this of 2. So it will generate between 5 and 7 objects per group, and we'll specify number of groups to be very many. And then we will specify the min distance placement to be 5. And what this min distance group placement means is that any object placed after this particular command is going to avoid these particular groups by 5 tiles. And not to be confused with temp min distance group placement, because temp min distance group placement has no bearing on any object that's placed after this. Temp min distance only applies to the objects in this particular branch here. So in order to, well, first we'll put terrain to place on DLC rock. So in order to prevent other objects from spawning too close to the rock terrain here, we're going to make sure that that's min distance group placement rather than temp min distance group placement. And so we can see the effect of this here is that we can place a lot of individual groups of rock objects, can provide a bit of an obstruction for units trying to climb this hill while always leaving a bit of space in between, and also ensuring that because of that min distance group placement that other objects on the map will not get placed on this rock terrain. For example, sheep could potentially be placed on this rock terrain if that distance wasn't present. So the next thing we'll copy over here is the player objects, town center, villager, and scout. We can see that generated those. And then we can generate our gold piles here. And there's not going to be any stone piles because, of course, the stone is all going to be on this area here. So one thing I want to point out here is that we are able to generate extra gold piles onto this intermediate area where we want the stone to be. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we take a look at the code for this particular extra gold, it has a min distance group placement attribute. So this can potentially affect the placement of stone mines if that particular create stone command was after this. So the min distance group placement value is only 3, so it probably won't have a very large effect. But let's talk about how we could potentially prevent the extra gold from spawning on this intermediate terrain where we would want the stone to be. So a terrain to place on attribute could potentially work. We could specify terrain to place on dirt 3, but that's not necessarily ideal because I don't want to restrict it to dirt 3 because it could also be placed on this dirt snow and be perfectly fine. So perhaps a more elegant way of doing this is by going back up to the land generation section and creating another generic land. And that terrain type is going to be the same as the base terrain. It's going to take up no area. It's not going to have any borders. The position is going to be 1, 1. And what we're also going to do is give it a land ID. So what that's going to do is it's going to create a land at position 1, 1. And since that's over here, and since the base terrain of the map is the same as this particular land that we've created, it's not going to show up. The only thing that we've done here is we've assigned a land ID. And so if we go back into our objects generation and we say place on specific land ID 1, we'll increase the number of groups just to make sure. So in order for that attribute to be satisfied, place on specific land ID, the land ID is going to apply to all the terrain that particular land is going to touch until we reach a restricted terrain. And since this DLC rock terrain is restricted for placing gold piles, there's no way to satisfy that place on specific land ID if we were to spawn the objects past this terrain. So if I were to say dirt 2, these two attributes are mutually exclusive. We cannot satisfy both place on specific land ID 1 and terrain to place on dirt 2 because of that terrain in the middle. And we can see that when we add that terrain, there's no extra gold that's being spawned at all. The only thing here is player gold. So we'll switch that back to 3, and we can generate this map with confidence that there's not going to be any extra gold that's going to be spawning on this intermediate area, which could potentially affect the stone mines that are going to be placed later on. Okay, so now we can place the stone on the map, which is all going to be placed on the terrain dirt 2. And so we can see that we have placed all those stone piles. And then just for another aesthetic effect, I'm going to put some more rock objects on this dirt 2. It's not going to take up too much space, and I'll explain why. So if we can see that these rock objects that were placed on dirt 2 are much more sparsely distributed than the ones that are on the rock terrain. And that's because that this particular create object rock command is very far down the code. So we have a lot of object commands before this that have a min distance group placement attribute. And since min distance group placement affects all of the objects placed after that particular command, since this particular rock command is very far down the list, it has to avoid the min distance that was provided by the original rocks that we created, which are these ones, and also has to stay a bit away from the stone mines here. It's not going to take up as much space as it would if that particular command were placed earlier on in the script. And then next we have our generic resources. So we have sheep, wolves, forage bushes, boars, deer, and straggler trees. We're able to generate those, no problem. And then now we're going to go on to the fish. So even though we're specifying a pretty large number of objects, the fact that our temp min distance group placement is rather high, it's going to result in very few fish that are actually going to be able to be placed. And then next comes the relics, which are going to be placed on shallow terrain with a temp min distance group placement attribute of 12 to make sure that it's not going to be very likely that we're going to have 2 relics per patch of shallow terrain. They're going to be more or less evenly distributed throughout this lake. And that is almost a completed map. So the one thing that we're missing here, I showed it before, is that every player is going to need a transport ship in order to scout this particular lake and realize that there aren't any fish, or there aren't very many fish. So let's try and copy this command here. We'll say transport ship, set place for every player, and we're going to go train to place on water. And we can see what that does here is absolutely nothing. And this should make sense to us because we know that we are not able to place player objects in an area that's separated from the player by a restricted terrain. We mentioned this before with the extra gold piles, but since the player lands are here, and since we have a terrain in between here and the water that's restricted for water objects, which is this rock terrain, there's no way that we can place a transport ship in the middle over here. And so in order to get around that, we'll basically use a temporary object, which is going to be 278, which is a dead fish trap. So instead of creating the transport ship, we'll create that temporary object, and we'll use transport ship as the second object to make sure that it's able to spawn on the water, and we have successfully been able to do that. So just to recap, since this dead fish trap object has no terrain restrictions whatsoever, it's going to be unaffected by the fact that there is rock terrain between the player lands and the water in the middle. So that's how that works. So it would be at this point where I would think the map was done, but after a bit more testing, I came to realize that I had produced a bit of a side effect that I wasn't intending, and I'll explain what that is. So back in the code, we remember a little while ago where we were trying to get this extra gold to spawn a certain way using a place on specific land ID attribute, and that prevented it from spawning on this intermediate dirt terrain where the stone was supposed to be. And so this achieved our goal, but it also produced a small side effect, and I'll demonstrate that here. So what I did is I increased the number of groups and made it so that the individual groups don't have to stay apart from each other. And if we can see what is happening here is that there is gold pretty much everywhere on the map except near the players because of the attribute min distance to players. But since we have a place on specific land ID attribute, this min distance to players attribute also means the minimum distance from the neutral land that we specified. And we can see that basically in this corner here, we're not able to place any extra gold because of the fact that we're placing on this specific land ID. And we can test that fact by removing this attribute, and we can see that this corner is no longer restricted for extra gold piles, but it came at the expense of now we're able to generate our extra gold on this intermediate terrain, which we were trying to avoid. But actually there is a simpler solution, and so instead of placing on a specific land ID, what we're going to do is, this is stone, is going to be max distance to other zones 7. So basically what max distance to other zones means is that these particular groups of gold will avoid restricted terrains by at least 7 tiles. And we can see if we generate this map that since the rock terrain is a restricted terrain for gold piles, the individual groups of gold will stay at least 7 tiles away from that. And since if we're referencing the top here, there's no way that these particular gold piles can satisfy 7 tiles away from this portion of rock terrain, as well as 7 tiles away from this portion of rock terrain, and still be able to find a place here. So we can see that even though we're generating many piles of gold, none of them are ever going to end up on this top portion here. So knowing all this stuff about how this land ID was going to affect our objects is useful, but in many cases the simpler solution is usually the better one, and that's what we are having here. So we can reduce the groups and bring back that temp min distance group placement. And now we can say that our map is done. So I spent all this time talking about the code. So let's take a step back and think about the concept of this map in general. So this map is not necessarily difficult to wall, but if you do end up walling, you're going to be, of course, walling yourself out of the stone. So there's a cost involved with that. And also let's try and think about the water here. So on a typical map, the decision to invest in water is usually pretty straightforward, because there's usually fish on water maps that can provide a very quick return on investment. But that's not necessarily the case on this map, since the benefits of controlling the water come much later on in the game, since you can have control of relics, and then later on you'd be able to control the stone on the hill a bit better. So that decision of whether to invest on the water and when to do that is a bit more interesting. So hopefully with this video I have helped shed some light on how a lot of knowledge about different scripting techniques can all come together and produce a creative map like this. And also I hope I've shed some light on the overall big picture and to see why this map was even necessary to realize that the original version was very one-dimensional, and that it, in my opinion, needed to be replaced with something a bit more creative. So I think that's going to be it for me for now. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope you've learned something.